Thank you. Okay, well, thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk about mainly in this first talk from The Burning Question, the book that I wrote with Duncan Clark. And it's really a big picture take on climate change and what's going on out there. And when we wrote it out of a sense that if you stand back from the climate change problem, and I mean stand right back, much further back than most politicians who are engaged in it, or even most activists who are engaged with the climate change problem, and even most scientists, you get to see some things which, in one sense, look dazzlingly simple once you get them, but also they look to us as though they were just being overlooked, and they weren't finding their way into the political debate properly, and they're still struggling to find their way into the political debate in the way that they need to. And when I say that they're big, simple messages, I mean they're so important that you actually can't hope to be, you can't hope to develop a useful and meaningful response to the climate change problem unless you've got your head around these things. So that's what I'm going to talk through just now. And I'm going to start off, don't worry, this isn't a maths lesson, but just to have a look at this exponential curve. So an exponential is a particular kind of curve, and it's got a constant proportional growth rate. So this particular one's going up at 1.8% per year. And that means that every 39 years or so, the steepness doubles, and the height of it doubles, and this will become critically important later, the area underneath the curve also doubles. It's every 39 years. Now, you get exponentials naturally occurring all over the place. You get them every time there's a feedback mechanism in which the growth is determined by how much of something there already is. So if you introduce foxes, let's say, to an island that's got plenty of rabbits but no other predators, you find the population of that, the fox population grows exponentially, because the more foxes there are, the faster they can breed, until something comes to interrupt that. And if you get into debt on your credit card, you find that the debt grows exponentially, because the more the debt, the more the more the interest on it, until something happens, like your bank manager gets in touch or something. So that's an exponential curve. And I've just fitted to that exponential carbon emissions from fossil energy use plus land use change. And the reason I've chosen that particular metric is that that is the closest measure we've got to carbon dioxide emissions resulting from human energy use going back to 1850. And I could have plotted all greenhouse gases, and I would have had a similar sort of fit, not quite so mathematically precise, but a similar sort of fit. But what you see here is that actually there's precious little deviation from a mathematical exponential curve. And if the statisticians crawl all over this and analyze that deviation, you find that sure enough, it really doesn't add up to much at all. That's not a coincidence. It really is exponential. And you can see that we've got a little bit of deviation here. We had a couple of world wars and a Great Depression, and that gave us a temporary little dip from which we bounced back by discovering a whole load of oil in the Middle East and stuff like that. And then we had another dip again, which was when we had some oil crises and some OPEC cartels and some decisions amongst a lot of oil producers to leave some fuel in the ground. But that was temporary, and we've bounced back, and we're soaring above it again. But the long-term trend is exponential 1.8% growth per year. And you might say, well, hang on a minute. Come on, that can't be right, because the last few years we've had global climate talks, we've had national and international agreements to leave fuel in the ground, we've had the UK and the EU have got carbon reduction targets, and we probably all know people, or maybe some of us are people, who deliberately think about maybe not flying as much, or maybe changing our diet, or changing how we consume in order to cut our carbon footprint. So surely some of that has made a difference. So let's zoom in on the last 10 years. They're not particularly statistically significant, but for what it's worth, we'll zoom in on them, and we'll see that, so that's the same curve just zoomed in, and we find that actually we're above the trend line, not below it. So just to be very clear, this carbon curve has shown no hint whatsoever of responding to the fact that humankind has noticed climate change, right? Not one speck, not a small bit, but we need to do more, not the faintest hint of a detectable dent in that curve. So so we've got this carbon curve. It's doubling every 39 years. No detectable change from business as usual. Very interestingly, it tells us that efficiency and innovation haven't yet helped us at all to come off that trend. Because if you think about it, we've had an awful lot of innovation and efficiency since 1850. Back in 1850, if we wanted to see each other now, we would have to set fire to something in order to have light. And now we've got LED light bulbs about 500 times more efficient. But you know what? The carbon footprint of humankind's lighting has gone up, not down. And even per capita, it's gone up, not down. And that's because we have so much more lighting now. And back in 1850, if we wanted to record a piece of information, we'd have to get a physical piece of paper and write something down or print it. And now we can store it digitally millions of times more efficiently. And you know what? The carbon footprint of our information storage has gone up, not down. Why? Because we're storing millions and millions of times more information. Oh, and by the way, we're still doing it in paper as well as, including in my book, but as well as digitally. So innovation and inefficiency haven't helped us. And in fact, you could argue that they've been part of the dynamics by which we've had that curve. And the final thing to note is that an exponential curve, the exact trajectory, is very strongly suggestive of a feedback mechanism, a powerful feedback mechanism that's going on at the global system level. And that's something which we need to break at a global system level. So, okay, the good news about exponentials is that they all come to an end, right? So the foxes on the island, eventually they'll do something like they'll eat the last rabbit, and then suddenly their population will stop growing exponentially. Or maybe they'll come to some happy equilibrium. And your bank, the debt on your credit card, that will either come to an abrupt halt, or maybe it'll come to some managed decline, but the exponential will eventually come to an end. So all exponentials come to an end. So the question is, what about this one? Maybe it will come to some end in some benign way, in a way that's benign for our species. So, and maybe we won't have to deliberately intervene to make it come to an end. Well, let's have a look. So there's a kind of 2 degrees stake in the ground that's been agreed to by just about, with one or two small exceptions, just about every country in the world is saying we must stay within 2 degrees. And I'm not going to go into the science of that, except to say that it's pretty well accepted. But a quick look at the history of it. So it originated from a piece of science that fed into the IPCC report. It was done in about the late 90s, actually, 1999 or so. And a group of scientists got together and they started looking at various different kinds of risks against temperature rise. The 2 most important to look at are this one and this one. This is the aggregate risks. So that's kind of, if you add them all up together, what do you get? And this is the risk of a large-scale discontinuity in the climate system. So that's reaching a point at which something tips, causing an abrupt, perhaps catastrophic change in the climate system that might make the conditions for life on Earth for humans a lot harder. So that's something we really, really wouldn't want to happen. And what they said was, this line here is 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And what they said was, if you take and nobody really knows what causes what and what temperature rise is going to be how hard for humans to deal with. But the balance of the view was that if you took at 2 degrees, you were keeping those risks to within a manageable level. Now, in 2009, those same scientists came back to the same analysis with the same methodology, but just using slightly more up-to-date models, and better data. And so that's the old analysis that they came up with, and this was the new analysis. And you'll see that the red lines have come a lot further down, and 2 degrees is sitting here, and we're well into the yellow, but not quite into the red on the areas that matter the most. So what we're saying about 2 degrees is it's pretty clear we definitely don't want to go any higher than that. We might get away with going a bit higher. We might not get away with even reaching 2 degrees, but we definitely don't want to play around with just drifting up here for the sake of it. It's risky enough as it is. So that's the 2 degrees. But let's stick with the 2 degrees for a minute and say, well, okay, so how much carbon can we burn if we're going to stay within 2 degrees? And the way the science works out is that it's a good approximation to say that actually it's the cumulative emissions that determine the temperature that we'll end up at. So that's the area underneath that exponential curve. So let's have a look at that. So the total budget. So this is how much, this is a year or two out of date actually, this chart's from the book now. So this has grown a little bit now, but that's how much we've burned already. And if we want a 50-50 chance of staying within 2 degrees, that's how much we've got left to burn. And if we want a 75% chance, then we've only got that much left to burn. And actually, since this is a year or two older, that's actually now nearer 600, and that's nearer 1500, because it is changing, rapidly. And don't forget, that carbon curve, those cumulative emissions are doubling every 39 years. So it takes us 39 years to add another blob that size. And another 39 years after that, we'll add a further 2 more blobs, taking it to 4 blobs. Right, that's how that curve's going. So this is just showing you the cumulative emissions, which are also exponential. So this is this just shows you the red line here is the cumulative carbon emissions that we've had, the actual. The blue line is the trajectory that we're on, and you can see that they fit. When you do the cumulative curve, you see that it really is, my goodness, there's virtually no detectable difference between the exponential, the mathematical exponential, and what's really happened. And then this is, I've switched units to carbon because I get this nice, neat trillion-ton mark, which is the sort of trillion-ton mark for the 2-degree threshold. So we're set to go through that in about 2045 or so. And 39 years later, and it's because the eventual temperature rise is roughly proportional to the cumulative emissions. So the 4-degree rise is about another 39 years after that. This is just roughly. So that's what we're on. That's where we're up. That's where we are right now. And that's what we need to do. This is for a 75% chance of staying within 2 degrees. So I've stylized this slightly. That's the trajectory we've been on. That's what we'd need to happen for a 75% chance. And you could look at that and say, that isn't going to happen. But what if we settle for a 50-50 chance? Well, then we could get away with that. Peak by 2020 and come down rapidly from there. That's looking extremely challenging, especially when you look at there's no dent whatsoever in that trajectory yet. Don't worry, this isn't all going to be doom and gloom, and particularly the second talk, there are some glimmers of optimism. I'll come to them later, so just hang on in there. Okay. So, but maybe we'll run out of fuel in time, because some people say, well, people have talked about peak oil and stuff, so maybe it's okay. Maybe the fuel will run out, and humankind won't have to actually take hold of this situation. It'll just coincidentally, benignly sort itself out on its own. So let's have a look. Let's have a look at how much fuel there is in the ground compared to how much we can burn. So here's a graph of, this chart here is the proven reserves. So this is the stuff which is on the books of the coal, oil and gas companies. It's defined as they are 90 or 95% certain that at today's market prices, with today's technologies, they can sell that stuff at a profit. So in other words, it's on the books. It's part of their assets. It's valuable to them. It's part of the company value. It's found its way into our pension schemes as well, most of us. And for a coin flip chance, a 50-50 chance, that's how much of it we could burn, about half. That's the proven reserves. But that's not all the fuel that's down there. Let's have a look at, here's a graph showing the total recoverable reserves. So this is the stuff that we know how to get it out of the ground, but we're not confident that all of it is yet profitable at today's market prices with today's technologies. So, and this is how much of it we could burn. We could burn about half the oil, or we could roughly burn the gas if we didn't burn any of the oil, and either way we couldn't burn any of the coal. That's how much. So there is far, far more coal, oil and gas in the ground than we can burn without frying ourselves. So why can't we stop taking it out of the ground? Because the stuff I've said to you so far, it's not rocket science and it's not really contestable. And one of the good news stories is that over the last 2 or 3 years, this message has increasingly come out there, and it's increasingly not contested. And there's a shared understanding we do need to leave that fuel in the ground. But why is it so hard? Because it's so not rocket science to point this out. And one of the things that Duncan and I found so kind of fascinating as we wrote the book is that some of these big picture messages we were coming out with, we just looked at each other and said, yeah, this stuff is so simple, it should have been flushed out decades ago. So So let's have a look at the value of fossil fuel reserves and infrastructure. It's very hard to estimate exactly, but it's somewhere around the $22 trillion mark. So for perspective, the UK's GDP is about $2 trillion. So we're talking about a lot of money, a lot of financial vested interest here. And what about the investment in developing those new reserves to make sure that to grow those stacks of carbon that we know about and we can get out of the ground? $674 billion a year. That's a lot of money going into investing in new reserves. So, and we need those new reserves, just to be clear, like we need a hole in the head. We do not need more fuel. And a much smaller number, but still very big in terms of kind of what it does in terms of PR. That's how much money in the US alone per year is going into financing the whole campaign around climate denial and confusion and promoting inaction on climate change. That's a lot of money, and it's been having a lot of influence. Okay, so what about renewables? Because some people are saying, well, it's okay, what we'll do is we'll get our renewables together, and that will just sort the problem out. We'll lose interest in fossil fuel. That would be great, and humans wouldn't have to deliberately intervene. So let's have a look at them, because and before I start this, I just want to make it very clear, renewables are a really important part of the solution, but I want to get in perspective whether on their own they're going to help us. So let's have a look. This is a graph showing the additional capacity that we had between 2000 and 2011. So this is how much did we grow our energy capacity by. And you'll see that we grew it by a bit of renewables, but where we really grew it was with the coal, oil and gas. So those renewables didn't replace the additional coal, oil and gas. They came as well as a growth in coal, oil and gas. And that is kind of, that's a story that we've actually seen before when we've brought new energy sources along. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So this is a graph that shows the history of some of our energy sources since 1850. I haven't drawn biofuels on here, which perhaps I should have done. Biofuels are more or less a constant along here, somewhere along this sort of line. So when coal came along, that's the yellow line, they didn't replace biofuels, they were as well as biofuels, growing sort of roughly exponentially. And then oil comes along, and you know what? Oil didn't replace coal. Coal carried on growing, arguably dented slightly, but oil took off on its own exponential, or roughly exponential, whilst coal kept on growing. And then gas came along here, and you know what? It didn't stop the oil growing or the gas growing. And then a bit later, nuclear came along, and with a story of its own. But all these new sources have been in addition to growth in the existing sources. And if you look very carefully at the bottom of this graph, you might just see a green line scraping along the bottom and just starting to come off the ground. So what needs to happen with renewables? If you think renewables are going to, on their own, just take over and make fossil fuels irrelevant, what you're asking for is that by about here, the renewable line will go right up through the roof and through the ceiling of the floor above, right? Which I'm not saying that's impossible. That could happen. But that wouldn't be enough. It would also need to do it in such a way that all these pin themselves to the ground. And there's no evidence that that would be the default. The evidence is that even if we grow renewables like crazy, unless we pin these down, do something to pin these other ones down, they will carry on growing too. So what about innovation and efficiency and national targets and personal carbon cutting and all that stuff? Let's have a quick look at that. So why hasn't that stuff helped? Because we expect it to. And the answer turns out to be that the trouble is that it's like squeezing a balloon. So you do something at a local level and you think you've made a saving, but the global system dynamics are such that actually that gets compensated for elsewhere. So I come from the UK and we're very pleased with our national targets. Because our emissions are going down nicely. But you know what? There are other countries in the world that have accelerated their emissions, and it's partly as a result of the things we've been doing. So we have more of our kit made in China now. So part of our emissions are actually are pushed onto the Chinese, and our growth rate has been lower. And that's partly because China has been higher and so on. So there's a system dynamic that goes on. And it's partly because of a thing called the rebound effect. So let's suppose I get a more energy efficient car and I can do twice as many miles to the gallon in that car. You'd think, well, that's a carbon saving. Surely I'm only going to use half the carbon now. But actually a whole myriad of rebound effects come in to undermine that. So the first is that I start driving a bit further because it's cheaper for me. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I've got an efficient car now, I can do a few more miles and I don't need to worry about it. So that absorbs some of the benefit. And the next rebound effect is that I save a bit of money because I'm still not spending quite so much on petrol. And I spend that money on something else. And that something else has a carbon footprint. So that's a bit more that's gone. And the third way it happens is that the oil company finds a way of selling its petrol to somebody else rather than me. It might adjust the price of oil, of petrol, a fraction. Or it might just redirect itself to a new market slightly. But one way or another, it finds a way of selling that oil elsewhere. And the fourth thing that might happen is a sort of less direct rebound. So I can drive more easily now, and it's cheaper for me to drive. So it's easier for me to go and live in suburbia, where land prices are cheaper, and I can buy a bigger house. So now I've got myself a bigger house, and that's harder to heat. So I'm spending more on my fuel bill. So the whole myriad of ways in which the rebound effect stacks up to make sure that efficiency savings on their own don't deliver anything. In fact, if you look at the sum total of all rebound effects across all the world's efficiency and innovation, you get to a rebound effect of 101.8% per year, averaged out, the amount that we grow our emissions by. And here's another reason, another way of looking at why sort of personal carbon savings don't, in their own right, end up doing anything at the global level. So you can look at it as there's three carriages of a train here, all coupled together. If you look at all the carbon coming out of the ground, it all gets burned to meet a human consumption need. So if you add up the carbon footprint of all the people in the world, you get the same number as you'd get if you add up the carbon footprint of all the combustion that goes on in the world, and that's the same number that you'd get if you added up all the carbon that's coming out of the ground. More or less. There's a little bit of plastic made, but it's not really that significant. So what this tells us is that, and these carriages are coupled together, so you can't slow this one down unless you also slow that one down and that one down. So if you work on all the consumers to try and make sure that they all lead low carbon lifestyles, that's fine. But if these guys are still just as intent on pulling the fuel out of the ground and selling it to somebody, they will find a way of undermining your effort to deal with things just at the consumption level. So I'm not saying that local carbon actions aren't useful. I think they are. I think they're really important, actually. And I think they send out cultural messages, and I think they enable the conditions under which the fuel could stay in the ground. But dealing with only one of these carriages on their own doesn't get us where we need to go. Okay, some people say, well, is it all down to population? Because population growth has been growing, hasn't it? So I'm just going to cover that one off quickly. So there's a little equation you can do, which is quite simple. It just says that total emissions equals the population times the GDP per capita, times the energy per GDP, times the carbon per unit energy. And you can look at those four parameters and track them through. And what's really interesting about them is that no one of those four parameters is exponential on their own. They all have a sort of wiggly story of their own to tell. They all take a different kind of line over the years. It's only when you multiply them together you get this uncanny exponential. What you find with population is that it's been growing sometimes very, very fast, and now it's still growing, but it looks as though it's going to top out. Somewhere between 9 and 11 billion, it will top out. And it'll be handy for us if it tops out at 9 billion. That'll make things a bit easier. But it's not a disaster if it's 11 billion. The IPCC, in the book, we've put a whole load of graphs showing all this stuff. But the IPCC recently summed it up with just one, which I'll just show you now. They looked at where the carbon emissions growth has come from in different decades. And you can see in the black here, the black one is the GDP per capita. So this is a story of people have been getting richer around the world. And the blue one here is story of population growth. And sure, the population has been growing. And this one here, that's below the line, is the energy intensity of GDP. So the world's economy has been decarbonising a bit in relative terms. And I'll just mention this red one here, which is that historically there's been a long-term trend that the carbon footprint of energy has been improving. The carbon intensity of energy has been improving. But the last decade tells the opposite story, because all the renewables that we've been hearing about and seeing going up all over the place have actually been dwarfed by the increase in coal that's been coming out of the ground. So the world's energy has been getting more carbon intensive, not less, over the last decade. Now I've talked so far only about fossil fuels. So I'm just going to quickly have a quick look at the whole land, food and biofuels and energy, that side of things, because it is an essential part of the story. So something like a quarter of all greenhouse gases in carbon dioxide equivalent are not carbon dioxide. And most of them are down to the food system. So I just want to do a quick sketch of the whole food system, just to have a look at some of the issues that we need to get on top of here. So I hope you can read the writing out. Up the top of there, this is just where the world's calories come from. So we grow in the world about 6,000 calories per person. That's fantastic. It's about 3 times what we need. What a brilliant story that is. So we grow 3 times what we need. And let's see where it goes. About 4,600 goes into an edible crop harvest. That's brilliant. Tons and tons more than we need. About 900 gets left in the ground because the supermarket decides it doesn't want it anymore, or it's slightly, the bananas are the wrong shape or something like that. So that's a very solvable problem, and it's clearly a problem, but it's, at face value at least, we can deal with that. And about 500 goes off to biofuels, and that's not bad, that's good. It's good to have biofuels. If we want to fly in a low carbon world, we're going to need some biofuels. But we need to keep an eye on it, because if that were to mushroom up in a massive way, it would impact on the edible food harvest, and possibly in quite a severe way. And so let's see what happens to that 4,600. Well, about 1,700 get fed to animals, and about 2,300 go to crops for humans. And the animals go and do really inconvenient, they eat a lot of grass as well, but then they go and do really wasteful things like walking around the place and keeping warm and stuff like that. And that is a source of a whole load of energy loss. But 500 comes back into the food chain for us. So we've still got this and this left for humans, which is plenty. Or it would be plenty if we didn't waste so much, and this is mainly in households in developed countries. That's the biggest source of this waste. Oh, I didn't mention this one up here, which is 600 goes to post-harvest waste, which is just food, mainly in developing countries, just rotting. And sometimes it's just for lack of plastic containers to put it in. But so we've still got 2,000 left to be eaten by humans. And if we shared that out perfectly, it would be great. We'd all just about be fine, but of course we don't. So about 1 billion go hungry. And I present this map because it's full of challenges, and it's also really full of opportunities. We've got 3 times as much as we need there. And even with some problems with climate change impacting on fertility and a few other things getting in the way, we've still got a land of opportunity here. And we can still have more biofuels if we just cut out some of the stupid things we're doing. And we've got opportunities to grow more efficiently as well. So, and while we're doing all this, we can even do it in such a way as to look after our biodiversity much better than we're doing at the moment. So there's tons of opportunity in the food system. If you compare it to the fossil fuel system, it's a lot easier to sort out, but we do need to do them both. Okay, so I'm going to just summarize where we've got to so far. So we've got, this is the emissions curve that we're on, and no hint of any dent in that whatsoever. We've got to stay within 2 degrees. Or we shouldn't take lightly going any higher than 2 degrees. So it means we've got to do something like that, which is going to be pretty hard work, especially given where we've been. And there's far more fuel in the ground than we can burn, so we're going to have to write it off. And the balloon squeezing effect tells us that we have to deal with things at the system level. It must be at the system level. And renewables on their own we've learned, won't sort things out. They are an essential part of the solution, but we need to also leave the fuel in the ground. And there's a whole kind of land and food system that we need to, that presents challenges and opportunities as well. So that's a kind of, that's some core evidence. But what's really interesting about it is that all that is so clear. You know, it's so not rocket science. And in fact, the book's been out for a year or two now, and you know, it's virtually uncontestable. But it's so clear that in a way it takes us to what's the real hub of the problem. Because if this was only it, you know, we'd be on it by now, and we surely would have sorted it. So the real heart of it all is, you know, why has the evidence been ignored so long? And in a way, this is the cutting edge of the climate change problem. It's the psychology. It's this amazing thing of the human mind, our capacity for doing this. And it happens in so many ways. There's so many ways in which we deny it, ignore it. We say, oh yes, climate change is a big deal, isn't it? And then we go and photocopy double-sided and pretend that's all we need to do and that'll solve the problem. And there are all these different forms of denial that we've got caught up in, and somehow we need to find a way through it. But I think my message, so you know, one way of looking at it is to say, well, the global brain just hasn't been working. There's been an absolute disconnect between the rational analysis, which is as clear as daylight, for all the complexity you can get into. The big picture message is as clear as daylight, but there's been a breakdown between that and the action. So there we go. So I've added into my summary slide now this, which I think is, you know, the essential and possibly the most important part of it all. But my message to you and to everybody really is that seeing that big picture evidence is like going through, it's like going through a gate. Once you've gone through it, and all of you have done that now, I'm sorry to say, you've gone through, you can't unknow this stuff. You now know it. You know that you know it. You know that your kids will know that you knew it. You know when you go to work, you know that you know this stuff. And you know, like it or not, you can't go back through it. It was a one-way gate. So I think quite often people tell me that this is some of the stuff I've just presented is quite a difficult and stark message. So this is my part one talk. In the next talk, we'll look at actually, there are ways through this, or there may be ways through this. And the good news about staring the difficult realities in the face is it takes you an awful lot closer to being able to find a solution that really would deal with it. So, and I think a lot of us come from a situation where we know deep down that we haven't been getting, the world has not been getting on top of climate change, and it's all started to look a bit helpless. Actually, a bit hopeless. Actually, if we stare the key messages in the face, then we can begin to pull together a proper solution that really would work, and that's what the next talk is going to be about. So thank you for listening.